before it was called After, a British dystopian audiobook, Part 1. Prologue. This is a work of fiction. What follows is a story that makes use of a document that circulated online and through private messages in the United Kingdom in recent weeks. The document was shared widely, often informally, sometimes as a joke, sometimes as a warning, and sometimes without comment at all. The document claimed to have been released by a group referring to itself as Shutdown Agenda 2030. No author was identified, no source was confirmed, no evidence was provided. This for the document were extreme, specific, and unsettling. They were presented in a procedural tone, written as if they were instructions rather than speculation. The document who encountered it, the document was dismissed quickly, laughed off, or forgotten. This story does not assert that the document was real. It does not attempt to verify its claims, explain its origin, or suggest that its contents were accurate. Within this narrative, the document exists only as an object, something that was read, forwarded, mocked, ignored, and in some cases, quietly revisited. The claims that follow are fictional. They explore how ordinary people might react when confronted with information they do not fully believe, but cannot entirely dismiss, and how behavior can begin to change long before certainty ever arrives. Any resemblance to real events, organizations, or individuals is coincidental. This is not a prediction. It is not a warning. It is a story about doubt, timing, and the human tendency to notice patterns after they have already begun. Chapter 1. I did not get the document from anywhere important. That was the first thing about it that felt normal. It came through on my phone while I was sat at the kitchen table, waiting for the kettle to finish. The phone buzzed against the wood, short and sharp, the way it always does when someone's dropped something into a group chat without thinking too much about it. Family WhatsApp. Maggie's side. One of her cousins had sent it. He was the sort who liked being first with things. News, rumors, videos he hadn't watched all the way through. Everything came with a joke attached, like that excused him from having to explain why he'd bothered. The message was brief, no build-up. Have a read of this, end of the world stuff? There was a laughing face on the end of it. That mattered more than I realized at the time. I didn't open it straight away. I never do. You get sent that much rubbish now that you learn to wait a beat, see if anyone else reacts first. Most things die quietly if you give them 5 minutes. Maggie was at the counter making sandwiches for work, the radio on low, newsreader talking about traffic somewhere else in the country. Sammy was upstairs, music thumping faintly through the ceiling, same bass line she'd been playing all week. Alan was already out, early shift stacking shelves, first proper job, still proud of setting his alarm before 6. It was a normal morning, ordinary, boring even. That's important. I poured the kettle, sat back down, and scrolled past the file without opening it. For a while, that was it. Then my phone buzzed again. Same document, different group. Work WhatsApp this time. The tone was different straight away. Less emojis, shorter messages. Someone had written, "Seen this?" Someone else replied with laughing faces. Someone else with a skull. Nobody actually said what was wrong with it, just that it was rubbish, like that had already been agreed. That should have been enough. I opened it while the tea cooled. No pictures, no logos, no dramatic title. Just text. That was the first thing that didn't fit. If you're making something up, you dress it up. Big fonts, red warnings, exclamation marks everywhere. This was plain, grey, almost dull. It looked like something that had been copied and pasted too many times. I skimmed the first few lines, expecting to get bored. Instead, I slowed down. It wasn't written like a warning. It wasn't written like a rant. It read like instructions. Not the sort you're meant to follow, more like the sort someone assumes you already understand. References to phases, windows, activation dates that weren't quite dates at all, language that sounded like it belonged in a planning document rather than a message doing the rounds on WhatsApp. I felt myself frown without realizing I was doing it. Maggie noticed. She glanced over from the counter, knife paused mid-spread, eyes sharper than her voice. "What you smirking at?" I told her it was just some daft thing going round. That wasn't a lie. Not exactly. She wiped her hands on a tea towel and leaned over my shoulder, close enough that I could feel her reading properly now, not skimming like the rest of us had. She didn't laugh. She took in a paragraph, then another. Why would someone write this? It wasn't accusatory, it was genuine. That was the first proper question anyone asked about it. I shrugged, said probably someone bored or trying to get attention. The usual answers, the ones that let you put things back where they belong. She stepped away again, back to the sandwiches, but slower than before, like she didn't want to stand there too long. Sammy came down just as the room went quiet. She took one look at our faces and said it before either of us could explain. "You two look cheerful." I handed her the phone. She skimmed it quicker than either of us had, eyes flicking down the screen, already half smiling. "That's dark." Then she grinned properly and nicked a bit of Maggie's toast, like she'd already decided it wasn't worth worrying about. That was it. 3 reactions, 3 seconds each. If you'd asked me then, I'd have said it would be forgotten by lunchtime. It wasn't. By the time I got to work, it had already done a full lap of the factory floor. Same file, same text, different jokes attached depending on who was sharing it. By break time, I was outside with Dave, leaning against the railings, steam rising from the vents behind us. Dave had that look on his face he always got when something sounded too serious for its own good. He waved his phone, barely glancing at the screen. "Here we go, lads. Get the tin-foil hats out." I told him I hadn't got that far. That was a lie. The document didn't say the world was ending. It didn't say anything dramatic at all. It talked about pauses, about temporary measures, about systems being taken offline and brought back up in phases. I'd worked long enough to know that temporary could stretch if nobody was watching. That night, after tea, I read it again. Not because I believed it, because I couldn't quite work out why someone would bother. No donation links, no calls to action, no instructions to share it before it disappeared. Just text. Calm, certain, written like it expected to be followed by people who would never see it. I saved it. Didn't tell anyone I had. I told myself it was just curiosity. Before bed, Maggie asked if I wanted a cuppa. I said yes. Outside, the street was quiet, same as always. And that was how it started. Not with panic, not with fear, just with a file that didn't behave the way nonsense usually does. Chapter 2. Nothing happened the next day. That was the problem. I woke up, went to work, came home again. The radio was still on in the mornings, the buses still ran. Maggie still complained about the price of things going up without the quality improving. Sammy was late one morning and early the next. Alan came home smelling of cardboard and disinfectant and said his feet were killing him. Normal carried on. And yet the document didn't quite go away. It stopped being sent around as much, but it started being mentioned. That was different. Like everyone had agreed it didn't need to be opened again, just nodded at. At work, someone said, "This is starting to feel a bit like that thing, isn't it?" Nobody asked which thing. Nobody laughed either. The first thing I noticed properly was the language. On the radio, a short piece about maintenance work on part of the rail network, temporary disruption, reduced service, operational review. All words I'd heard before, just not usually together. Later that day, Maggie mentioned her rota had been changed. No explanation, just fewer hours next week and a note saying it was being reviewed centrally. Centrally where? She asked me, not really expecting an answer. I didn't have one. That night, I opened the document again. I didn't scroll, I searched. Certain phrases stood out now that they'd been planted in my head, the way you can't unhear a word once you've learned it. Phases, windows, compliance. It still didn't read like a threat. It read like something that assumed resistance wouldn't matter. I closed it again and told myself I was being stupid. The kids weren't worried. That helped. Sammy mentioned someone at work had joked about that March thing and rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might stick. Alan said one of the supervisors had told them not to talk about stuff like that on shift because it put customers on edge. That was the first time anyone had said not to talk about it. Dave noticed it too. We were on break again, same railings, same lukewarm tea in paper cups. He was quieter than usual, which for Dave was noticeable. "Feels like everyone's just waiting," he said, staring past the car park. "For what?" I asked. He shrugged. "Something to tell us it's definitely bollocks." That stuck with me. Waiting for proof something wasn't happening felt backwards. But once I noticed it, I saw it everywhere. People delaying plans, deliveries arriving later than usual, signs going up on roads that didn't normally need signs. Nothing dramatic, nothing you could point to and say, "There, that's it." Just small hesitations, like the country had put its foot on the brake without telling anyone. I didn't mention the document again at home. Maggie didn't either. But she started keeping the cupboards fuller than usual. Not stockpiling, just topping things up earlier. She bought an extra bag of rice one shop, then another the week after. I noticed. She noticed that I noticed. Neither of us said anything. One evening, Sammy asked why her bus had been rerouted without warning. Alan said a delivery hadn't turned up at work and nobody seemed bothered about chasing it. Probably just systems, Maggie said automatically. Systems. That was the word the document used. I stopped laughing at it after that. I didn't start believing it, not properly. Belief felt too strong a word, too committed. What I did instead was start adjusting. Little things, sensible things, the sort of things you could justify to yourself without feeling daft. I filled the car up when it dropped below half instead of waiting. I charged my phone whenever I could. I saved a few numbers offline just in case. I told myself I was just being organized. That's the trick with things like this. They don't ask you to panic. They ask you to prepare quietly. The document had a phrase for it. I remembered it without looking. Pre-movement hesitation. The idea that people don't freeze. They hover. They wait. They do nothing obvious, but they stop committing. By the end of the week, that was the feeling everywhere. Hovering. On Friday night, Maggie stood at the window a bit longer than usual before pulling the curtains. "Feels quiet," she said. "It's late," I told her. She nodded, but she didn't sound convinced. Later, lying in bed, I thought about March. Not the date, the idea of it. The document hadn't promised anything would happen straight away. It just said that after a certain point, things wouldn't go back the way they were meant to. That was what bothered me. Not the end of the world. Just the end of before. I fell asleep telling myself I was overthinking it. The trouble was, more and more people seemed to be doing the same thing. Overthinking together. Chapter 3. The first thing that actually changed was the timetable. Not officially, not in a way you could complain about. Just quietly. Alan came home one afternoon and said his shift had been cut short. No reason given. Just sent home early with a shrug and a promise it'd be sorted next week. Sammy said one of her mates had been told not to come in at all, but not to worry because it was only temporary. Temporary started turning up everywhere. On the radio, on emails, on notices stuck to doors with blue tack. Maggie's supermarket changed its opening hours without much explanation. An A4 sheet by the entrance, printed in a hurry. Customers complained for about a day, then stopped. People adapt faster than they realize. At work, a delivery didn't arrive, then another. Nothing vital, nothing you couldn't work around. Management said it was a supplier issue and left it at that. Dave said, "Feels like someone's tidying up without telling us." I laughed, because that's what you do when someone says something a bit too close to the bone. But later, on my own, I opened the document again. I wasn't looking for dates anymore. I was looking for language. Certain phrases kept appearing in places they hadn't before. Not word for word, nothing that obvious, but close enough to feel familiar. Operational adjustment, capacity review, reduced throughput. I started noticing how often nobody was in charge. You'd ask a question and get told it was being handled elsewhere, or that it had come from above, or that it wasn't something anyone on site had decided. Above where? Elsewhere where? Those answers used to be rare. Now they were standard. At home, Maggie rearranged the cupboards again. Not adding much, just spreading things out so it didn't look like there was too much of anything in one place. "You expecting company?" I asked her. She shook her head. "Just feels sensible." Sensible was doing a lot of work lately. One evening, Sammy asked if she could stay over at a friend's at the weekend. Maggie hesitated, just for a second too long, before saying yes. Alan noticed it too. "What's that about?" he asked later. "Nothing," Maggie said, but I could hear it in her voice. The calculation, the quiet weighing up. I started paying more attention to the roads, diversions that didn't make sense, signs pointing traffic away from places that hadn't changed, cones that stayed up for days without anyone working near them. Once you notice those things, you can't stop seeing them. On Thursday, the council website went down. Just a maintenance message, apologetic, no end time given. Dave mentioned it on break. "Can't even check the bins now," he said, trying to make it sound like a joke. Nobody laughed. The document talked about this stage as if it were the easiest part, not because nothing was happening, but because everything still looked like it was. Shops were open, schools were open, people were still arguing about football and television and the weather. But plans started getting shorter. Nobody booked anything too far ahead. Nobody committed to anything that couldn't be cancelled. It was like the future had shrunk. One night, Maggie asked me outright, "You don't actually think that thing's got anything to do with this, do you?" I told her no. That was true, mostly. "I just think," I added carefully, "it's odd how often the same sort of words keep turning up." She nodded, slow. "Feels rehearsed," she said. That was exactly the word I'd been avoiding. After that, we stopped mentioning the document by name. It didn't need it anymore. We both knew what we were circling around. Alan came home one day and said a supervisor had told them to make sure they knew how to get home without relying on the bus app, just in case. "Just in case what?" I asked. He shrugged. "Didn't say." That night, I went through the house and checked things I hadn't checked in years. Batteries, torches, paper copies of numbers we'd stopped memorizing. Nothing dramatic, nothing you could point to. But it was effort, and effort means intention. Lying in bed, listening to the house settle, I realized something uncomfortable. If nothing happened now, we'd still changed. Even if the document was nonsense, especially if it was nonsense, it had done its job. It had made people pause. It had made us wait. And once you're waiting, you're already halfway to accepting whatever comes next. I didn't sleep well that night. Not because I was scared, because I had the feeling that something, somewhere, had already started moving, and nobody was going to announce it until it was finished. Chapter 4. No two-thirds arrived without calling itself a rule. It came as a suggestion, wrapped in polite language and delivered through channels nobody thought to question. A notice at work about revised procedures, a message from the school reminding parents about attendance expectations, a sign at the supermarket asking customers to be patient while new systems were embedded. Embedded where wasn't explained. At the factory, we were told to clock in a different way. Nothing complicated, just a temporary adjustment while they tested something. Dave joked that at least it gave him something new to complain about. But he followed it. So did everyone else. At home, Maggie came back from work quieter than usual. She said the manager had gathered them together for a briefing that didn't actually say anything, just reassurances, just reminders about safety and flexibility. They kept saying, "for now," she said, like they wanted us to remember it. That night, the kids were both on their phones more than usual, not scrolling aimlessly, checking, looking things up, then putting the phones down again without sharing what they'd found. Sammy asked if we'd noticed how many places were closing early. Alan said his bus had stopped showing live times and was just listed as running. Running where, exactly, didn't seem to matter. On the news, a short segment about supply adjustments ran after the weather. The presenter smiled the whole time, voice steady, reassuring. The words underneath told a different story if you paid attention. No shortages, no cause for concern, minor delays expected. Expected by whom? I stopped bringing the document up altogether. There was no need. It sat there quietly between us, like a reference point we all pretended not to share. One afternoon, I took a different route home without really deciding to. The usual road was coned off, traffic funneled somewhere else. No workmen, no machinery, just signs and patience. I noticed how few people complained. Everyone assumed there was a reason. At tea, Maggie mentioned her cousin again, the one who'd sent the document in the first place. Apparently, he'd posted something vague on social media about being told to sit tight. "What does that even mean?" Sammy asked. "It means nothing," Maggie said too quickly. Later, when the kids were in their rooms, Maggie sat down beside me and said, "I don't like how quiet people are being about it." "About what?" I asked. She looked at me for a moment, then shook her head. Exactly. At work, one of the older lads handed his notice in. No fuss, no explanation. Said he was taking some time while he still could. Nobody asked him where he was going. Dave said, "Wish I could do that." He didn't laugh when he said it. By the end of the week, new phrases had crept in. Stay flexible, allow extra time, follow guidance as issued. Guidance from where, nobody ever said. The document had called this part behavioral alignment. I remembered that without opening it, which bothered me more than if I'd had to check. It felt like the world had stopped asking for permission. People weren't being forced, they were being nudged, shifted, moved half a step at a time. That's harder to argue with. One evening, the power flickered while Maggie was cooking. Just a second, long enough for the clock on the microwave to reset. Everyone froze. Then it came back on, and nobody said anything. We ate in silence, listening to the hum of the fridge like it was something new. Later, lying in bed, Maggie said, "If nothing's wrong, why does it feel like we're being prepared for it?" I didn't answer straight away, because the honest answer was that I didn't know. And I was starting to suspect that not knowing was part of the design. The document hadn't promised chaos, it promised order. And order, once it starts organizing itself, doesn't need anyone to explain it. It just needs people to comply without being asked. Chapter 5. Controlled, procedural calm. The instruction came through as an update, not an order, not an announcement. An update. It arrived on Maggie's phone first, late afternoon, while she was still at work. A message from head office, forwarded by the store manager with a single line underneath. Please read and acknowledge. That was new. When she got home, she put her bag down and didn't take her coat off straight away. She stood in the kitchen, reading the screen again, then once more, like she was trying to spot something she'd missed the first 2 times. They want us to stay on site after closing, she said eventually. For how long? I asked. She shook her head. Doesn't say. Just until further notice. No leaving early, no swapping shifts. That's not legal, is it? She shrugged. They're calling it a safety measure. Safety had become a word that didn't invite questions anymore. At the factory, it was similar. A notice pinned up near the clock-in machines, laminated. Someone had gone to the effort. All staff are required to remain available for the duration of their scheduled shift. Early departure must be authorized. Remain available. Dave read it twice, then laughed without smiling. Available for what? He said. No one answered. By the end of the day, people were checking their phones less. Not because there was nothing on them, but because there was too much. Messages that said very little. Updates that explained nothing. Sammy came home later than usual, said her bus had stopped short and they'd all been told to walk the rest of the way. No reason given. Just a man in a high-vis vest pointing and saying it was temporary. Alan said his supervisor had asked everyone to confirm their home addresses for records. For what records? He'd asked. The supervisor had shrugged. Just making sure we've got the right details. That night, I opened the document again. I didn't feel dramatic about it. I didn't feel scared. I felt methodical. There it was. The language. The same careful phrasing. The same confidence that people would comply because the inconvenience was small and the justification sounded reasonable. I realized something then that made my stomach tighten. Up until now, everything had been optional in practice, even if it didn't feel like it. You could still leave early. You could still change plans. You could still say no. This was different. This asked for acknowledgement. Maggie noticed me staring at the screen. You thinking what I'm thinking? She asked. I don't know, I said. What are you thinking? But once you say yes to something like this, it doesn't matter whether it was necessary or not. She was right. The kids picked up on it too. Sammy asked if we were still going to her mate's birthday the following weekend. Alan asked if his shift pattern might change again. I told them we'd see. I hated how often I was saying that. Later, the news ran a short segment about temporary movement guidance being trialed in certain areas. No map, no details, just reassurance that it was precautionary and limited. Limited was another word doing a lot of work. Outside, the street was quieter than it should have been for that time of evening. A couple of houses dark that were usually lit. A car parked awkwardly halfway onto a curb, like it had been left in a hurry. I stood at the window longer than usual, watching nothing happen. For the first time since the document appeared, I thought about what it would mean if it wasn't wrong. Not in the big, dramatic sense, just in the small one. What if this was what it looked like when something real started? No sirens, no announcements, just instructions that stopped being optional one by one. I closed the document and didn't put the phone down straight away, because whether I liked it or not, the line had shifted. And this time, I was certain of one thing. If there was a moment where you could still pretend this was coincidence, we were already past it. Chapter 6. Boundary wasn't marked with a fence. It was marked with confusion. Alan came home one afternoon and said his bus hadn't turned up at all. Not late, not cancelled, just absent. The stop was still listed on the route, the timetable still showed a service, but nothing arrived. People waited for a while, then drifted off in different directions. He walked most of the way. They said it was a driver issue, he told us, dropping his bag by the door, but nobody seemed surprised. Sammy said something similar had happened to one of her friends the day before, a train that stopped short and emptied out without explanation. An announcement apologizing for the inconvenience and nothing else. At work, a security guard appeared at the gate who hadn't been there before. Same uniform style, different badge. Polite, smiling, checking names against a list before waving people through. No one objected. Dave nudged me as we waited our turn. Didn't know we were that important, he said. But he still handed over his ID. Inside, nothing was different. Machines ran, supervisors walked the floor, break times came and went. But everyone was aware of the gate. That evening, Maggie showed me her phone. A message from work asking staff to confirm availability over the coming weeks. No shifts listed, no dates, just a box to tick. Feels like booking leave in reverse, she said. We laughed, because laughing was still an option. At least it felt like one. Later, a letter came through the door. Not addressed to anyone in particular, just the occupier. Inside was a single page explaining that local travel arrangements were being adjusted and that residents were advised to remain within their immediate area unless travel was essential. Essential was not defined. I read it twice, then left it on the table where everyone could see it. Sammy read it standing up. Alan sat down. So, work? Alan asked. For now, Maggie said. That phrase again. The document had warned about this stage, not in detail, just enough to say that once movement became something you had to justify, behavior would change faster than any announcement could manage. I found myself mentally mapping the area around the house. Shops, roads, shortcuts. Things I hadn't consciously thought about in years. I didn't like that I was doing it. On the news, the language stayed soft. No restrictions, just guidance. No enforcement, just cooperation. Interviews with officials who said the same thing in slightly different ways. It's about keeping things running smoothly. Smoothly for whom wasn't asked. That night, the power flickered again. Longer this time. Long enough for the lights to go out and the house to breathe differently. When it came back on, Maggie said, "That's twice this week." Nobody replied. In bed, I thought about how quickly we'd accepted the idea of staying close to home, how little effort it had taken to redraw the edges of our days. I realized something else then. Nobody had told us we couldn't leave. They'd just made staying easier. The document called it containment by convenience. I remembered that without opening it, and that scared me more than anything else so far. Because convenience doesn't feel like force. It feels like choice. The next morning, a message came through on my phone before I'd even got out of bed. A simple alert. Please ensure your device remains active and location services are enabled for service continuity. No explanation, no sender name I recognized, just a button marked Acknowledge. I sat there longer than I meant to, phone in my hand, listening to the house wake up around me. Downstairs, Maggie was making tea. The kids were moving about, getting ready like they always did. Normal, still, but thinner. I thought about all the times I'd told myself this was nothing. All the times I'd said, we'll see. This felt like the thing the document had been circling. Not the event, the moment when you were expected to agree you were already part of it. I didn't press anything, not yet. But for the first time, I understood exactly what the document meant by activation. Not a switch being thrown, a series of small yeses. And I had the uncomfortable feeling that most of them had already been given. Chapter 7. Controlled unease, consequences beginning to surface. The problem with not responding was that it didn't stay neutral. By mid-morning, the message had come through again, same wording, same calm tone, still no name attached to it. Just a reminder, sitting at the top of my screen like it belonged there. Maggie got one too. She didn't mention it at first. She read it, frowned slightly, then slipped the phone into her pocket and carried on making breakfast like it could wait. Sammy noticed before either of us said anything. "Why is my phone asking for location stuff again?" she said, spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "It already does that?" Alan checked his and said he hadn't had anything yet. That didn't reassure me the way it should have. At work, the gate check took longer. Same polite guard, same smile, but now he ticked names off with more care. A couple of people were pulled aside and spoken to quietly before being let through. Nobody asked why. Dave leaned in and said, "Feels like school again." I nodded, but my eyes were on the clipboard. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted. Not tense, that would have been easier, but alert. People were present in a way they hadn't been before. Phones stayed face down. Conversations were shorter. By lunchtime, the message had changed. Not the words, the timing. It arrived while I was on break, screen lighting up in my hand like it knew I was looking. Please acknowledge to avoid disruption. Disruption to what? It didn't say. Dave showed me his phone. Already clicked it, he said. Didn't fancy finding out what disruption meant. That was the first time anyone had admitted complying out loud. Back home, Maggie was quieter than usual. She'd acknowledged it too. She said it like it was a fact, not a decision. "They asked us to," she said. "Everyone else was doing it." Sammy had pressed it without thinking. Alan still hadn't received anything and didn't know whether that made him lucky or not. That evening, a neighbour knocked on the door. We'd lived next to them for years without more than a wave. Now he stood there awkwardly, hands in pockets, eyes darting down the street before settling on me. "Just checking you lot are all right," he said. "Why wouldn't we be?" I asked. He shrugged. "Just thought I'd ask." He didn't come in, didn't explain, just nodded and walked back to his house. I watched him go and realized what had changed. Absence was starting to show. Not people vanishing, not yet, but gaps in routines. Cars that didn't move, lights that stayed off, phones that didn't ring when you expected them to. The document had mentioned this part almost casually, how non-response would be logged before it was questioned, how silence would stand out more than refusal. That night, the alert came through again. Same message, same button. This time it buzzed twice. I held the phone and felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't felt before. Not fear. Recognition. This wasn't about keeping services running. It wasn't even about control, not directly. It was about narrowing the field, making sure everyone was accounted for, and noticing who wasn't. I pressed acknowledge. The phone went quiet. Nothing happened straight away. No confirmation, no follow-up. Just silence. That was almost worse. Later, lying in bed, Maggie said, "Do you think it matters if someone doesn't?" "Yes," I said without thinking. "Why?" I stared at the ceiling and pictured the clipboard at the gate, the empty bus stop, the neighbor checking in without saying why. "Because now," I said, "they're counting." I slept badly. In the morning, a new notice was pinned up at work. Failure to comply may result in restricted access. No explanation of access to what, no appeals process, no end date. Just a statement, laminated and level, like it had always been there. I thought about the document and how it had never once mentioned force. Only filtering, only narrowing, only progression. And for the first time since all this began, I wondered not what would happen next, but who would notice if someone wasn't there to see it. Chapter 8. Quiet certainty. Consequences now visible. The restriction didn't announce itself. It just worked. Dave wasn't at the gate when I arrived. That was the first thing I noticed. He was usually early, always had something to say about the weather or the traffic or whatever had irritated him since the day before. I waited a moment, scanning the line. A few faces I recognized, a few I didn't. The guard was still there, same uniform, same polite nod, different clipboard. When it was my turn, he checked my name, paused, then nodded me through without comment. I glanced back once, out of habit more than concern. Dave wasn't there. Inside, the floor felt quieter. Not fewer people, just less noise. Conversations that usually filled the space had thinned out, like everyone had agreed to keep things to themselves. By mid-morning, someone asked where Dave was. No one answered straight away. Eventually, a supervisor said he'd been stood down pending review. "Review of what?" someone asked. The supervisor shrugged. Access. That was the word again. At home, things were off in small ways. Alan said 2 lads from his shift hadn't been in for days and nobody was covering their hours. Sammy said her manager had been replaced without warning. No farewell, no explanation, just a new face and a reminder about compliance. Maggie came back with a look she couldn't quite hide. "They wouldn't let one of the women leave early," she said. "Her mum's ill, properly ill. They said she'd acknowledged availability." "And that means what?" I asked. She shook her head. "Means she stayed." That night, a notice went up at the end of the street. Temporary travel guidance, printed on laminated card, cable tied to a lamppost. It listed streets, not areas, specific turnings, short distances. I walked past it twice before reading it properly. Recommended, advised, for your safety. No enforcement mentioned, just expectation. The next morning, Alan's bus route was removed from the app entirely. Not cancelled, gone. When he asked at the stop, the driver of a different route told him it had been rationalized. Rationalized where? Sammy didn't go to work that day. She said she'd had a message telling her to wait for further instruction. No date, no shift, just wait. She tried to joke about it. It didn't land. I went looking for Dave's number that evening and realized I didn't have it saved properly. Just a name and an old message thread. I sent him a quick text. "You all right?" It stayed unread. The document had mentioned this point, though I'd skimmed past it at the time. The part where access stopped being about places and started being about people. I stood at the kitchen window again, watching the street settle into evening. A couple of houses were still dark, more than before. A van rolled slowly past, windows opaque, no markings I recognized. It didn't stop. Maggie joined me, arms folded. "Feels different now," she said. "Yes," I replied. Not louder, not violent, just narrower. Later, the phone buzzed again. A new message this time. "Your status has been updated. No option to acknowledge. No explanation." I stared at it longer than I should have. "What does that mean?" Maggie asked. "I don't know," I said. And for the first time, that answer felt like a liability. I thought about Dave, about the neighbor, about the people who hadn't argued, hadn't refused, just hadn't quite fitted anymore. The document hadn't called this a lockdown or an emergency. It called it consolidation. The idea that once movement, access, and availability were aligned, everything else would follow naturally. I turned the phone face down on the table. Because whatever this was now, it wasn't something you could opt out of quietly. And I had the growing certainty that the next change wouldn't arrive as a message at all. It would arrive as an absence. Chapter 9. Quiet gravity. Absence now normalized. Dave's locker was still there. That was what did it. I hadn't meant to look for it. I was just passing, heading for the sink, when I saw the door with the dent in the corner where he'd kicked it years ago and laughed about it for weeks after. Same padlock, same old sticker half peeling off. Empty shift. Empty space beside me on the line. I asked the supervisor if Dave was coming back. He didn't say no. He didn't say yes. He said, "It's being handled." Handled where? I didn't ask. I already knew how that conversation would go. By lunchtime, someone else was working Dave's station. A lad I didn't recognize, quiet, eyes down, like he was trying not to take up too much room. Nobody mentioned Dave again. That evening, Maggie told me her cousin had deleted his social media. Not deactivated, gone. Photos, posts, everything wiped. Probably just fed up, she said, but she didn't sound convinced. Sammy came home early and said her friend, the one she'd been planning to stay over with, hadn't answered messages all day. No explanation, just silence. "She's always on her phone," Sammy said, "even at work." Silence had stopped meaning nothing. Alan asked if he could go round to his mate's house, just down the road. We both hesitated. Then Maggie said yes, but asked him to text when he got there, and when he left, and when he was on his way back. We all noticed it. Nobody commented. When Alan didn't text straight away, I felt it in my chest before I thought it through. That sudden, sharp awareness that things had shifted enough for worry to arrive before logic. He texted a minute later. "All good." I sat back down, embarrassed at myself, but the feeling didn't go away. Later that night, I went looking for the document again. I didn't read it. I didn't need to. I just scrolled until I found the part I'd been avoiding. The section that talked about attrition. Not removal, not enforcement, attrition. The idea that once systems were aligned, people would simply fall out of them. Miss a step, fail to respond, be absent long enough that the absence became permanent. No confrontation required. I closed the file. On the news, a short item ran about improved compliance levels, charts without numbers, smiling officials talking about resilience and cooperation. I wondered who wasn't included in those charts anymore. The next morning, the house opposite ours was empty. Not abandoned, just unused. Curtains open, bin still out, car gone. Maggie noticed it too. "They didn't say anything," she said. "They don't have to," I replied. I took a different route to work without thinking about it, then realized halfway there that the old one had been blocked again. Same cones, same signs, no work. At the gate, the guard hesitated over my name for longer than before. He smiled, still polite. "All good," he said eventually. Inside, the board had been updated. Names grouped now, not departments, categories. I didn't recognize all of them. By mid-afternoon, I realized something else. Nobody was asking where anyone had gone. That was the moment it stopped being gradual, when absence stopped raising questions and started being absorbed. That evening, Sammy asked very quietly, "If someone just didn't come home one day, who would notice first?" I told her not to think like that, but I knew exactly why she was asking. Later, Maggie sat beside me and said, "This doesn't feel like waiting anymore." No, I agreed, because waiting implies something's coming. This felt like it had already arrived, and we were only just catching up to it. I lay awake long after the house had gone quiet, listening for sounds that meant everything was still where it should be. The fridge humming, a car passing, Alan turning over in his sleep. Normal things, anchors. Because now, more than anything else, I understood what the document had really been warning about. Not an event, a thinning. And the real danger wasn't being taken. It was being quietly removed from the count without anyone ever saying your name out loud. Chapter 10. Controlled inevitability, procedural calm with underlying finality. The choice didn't arrive as a question. It arrived as an assumption. When I got to work that morning, the guard didn't check my name straight away. He asked me to wait to one side, just for a moment, with the same calm tone he used for everything else. 2 other people were already there, both of them looking anywhere but at each other. It wasn't long, a minute, maybe 2, but it was long enough to feel deliberate. Eventually, a supervisor I'd never seen before came over. He had a badge that didn't quite match the others and a clipboard that looked newer than it needed to be. "Just need to confirm a few details," he said, friendly enough. "Nothing to worry about." That phrase again. He didn't ask for anything dramatic, just my address, my phone number, whether I'd received the recent updates and acknowledged them. "Yes," I said. He ticked a box and nodded. "Good," he said. "We're trying to keep things streamlined." Streamlined was another word that had found its way into everything. Inside, my station had been moved. Not far, just enough to notice. A different position on the line, closer to the end than the middle. Still work, still necessary, but not central. Dave's old space was gone now, not reassigned, just removed, like it had never been there. At lunch, nobody talked about it. Nobody talked much at all. When I got home, Maggie was already there, sat at the table with her coat still on. Her phone lay face down beside her, like it might say something she didn't want to hear. "They want me in tomorrow," she said. "Earlier than usual." "Why?" "They didn't say." She took a breath, then added, "They asked if I could be flexible." Flexible had stopped meaning helpful. Sammy came in not long after. She said her friend had finally replied. Just one message. No explanation. "Can't talk right now. Sorry." Alan said one of his mates hadn't shown up for work and the supervisor had told them not to speculate. Speculate about what? That night, another message arrived on my phone. Not a reminder this time, an instruction. "Please attend the designated center tomorrow at 1800 for verification." No address I recognized, just a postcode and a line saying attendance was expected. Expected. I showed Maggie. She read it, handed it back, and sat down slowly. "That's not optional, is it?" she said. I shook my head. "No," I said. "It isn't." We didn't argue. There didn't seem to be a point. Sammy hovered in the doorway, pretending not to listen. Alan sat on the stairs, quiet in a way that made him look younger than he was. "I'll go," I said finally. "See what it is." "Together?" Maggie asked. I checked the message again. Just my name. "No," I said. Just me. That was the moment the house changed. Not loudly, not all at once. Just the knowledge that whatever came next wouldn't involve all of us. I went to bed early and didn't sleep much, not because I was afraid of what might happen, but because I kept trying to imagine what verification actually meant. The document had used the word sparingly, like it was a formality, a way of sorting things cleanly. The center turned out to be an old leisure complex on the edge of town, floodlit, quiet, cars parked neatly in rows like they'd been guided there, people queued without speaking. Inside, it was warm and smelled faintly of disinfectant. A woman smiled at me and handed me a card with a number on it. "Take a seat," she said. "You'll be called shortly." Shortly stretched. I watched people stand up when their numbers flashed, then disappear through doors that closed softly behind them. Some came back out, some didn't. Nobody looked distressed. Nobody looked relieved either. When my number appeared, I stood up and followed the arrow on the wall. The room I was taken into wasn't threatening. A desk, 2 chairs, a screen showing my name and a series of green ticks. The man opposite me didn't introduce himself. "Just a few final checks," he said. "Then we'll confirm your status." I thought about Maggie, the kids, Dave's locker, the empty house opposite. I thought about all the times I'd told myself this was nothing. "Confirm it as what?" I asked. He smiled, just slightly. "Appropriate," he said. That was when I understood. This wasn't about proving who you were. It was about deciding where you belonged. And I had the unmistakable sense that whatever answer came next would not be one I'd be invited to question. Chapter 11. Institutional calm. Time feels altered, emotionally flattened. I didn't walk out of the room the way I'd walked in. Not because they stopped me, because time moved differently after that point. The man didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten me. He didn't even seem particularly interested in me as a person. I was a line on a screen, a set of ticks and gaps that needed resolving. He asked me to confirm details I already knew were correct. Address, employment, family status. Nothing invasive. Nothing you could refuse without sounding unreasonable. Each answer nudged another tick into place. "Thank you," he said more than once, like courtesy was part of the process. At one point, he paused and looked at the screen longer than before. "That may take a moment," he said. "For what?" I asked. He didn't answer straight away. He typed something, waited, then nodded to himself. "Cross-checking," he said finally, "just to make sure everything aligns." Aligns. I watched the cursor blink. When he spoke again, his tone hadn't changed. "You'll need to remain available this evening," he said. "Travel home is not advised at this time." "That wasn't mentioned," I said. "No," he replied. "It wouldn't have been." I thought about Maggie waiting by the phone, about Sammy pretending not to worry, about Alan trying to act older than he felt. "I need to let my family know," I said. He smiled, still polite. "They'll be informed," he said. That was the moment. Not fear, not anger. The moment when I realized I was no longer the one expected to do the informing. I was guided to a waiting area, not a holding room, nothing so obvious, Just rows of chairs and a screen showing generic information about cooperation and continuity. People sat quietly, some looking at the screen on their phones, some staring straight ahead. Nobody spoke. I checked mine. No signal. Not gone, just unavailable. Time passed without markers. Eventually, a voice came over the speaker. Calm, neutral. "Thank you for your patience. Further instructions will be issued shortly." Shortly again. I thought about all the times that word had been used, how easily it had slipped into everything. I wondered how long shortly could stretch. Somewhere behind a door I couldn't see, something final was being decided. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just sorted. I thought about Dave, about the empty house, about the way people had stopped asking questions because answers were no longer expected. I understood then what the document had really been. Not a threat, not a warning, a description. A description of how things look before anyone admits they've changed. The screen in the waiting area flickered. Text appeared. Status confirmed. Nothing else. No explanation, no instruction. Just confirmation that something had now been settled. I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not relief, something colder. The calm that comes when a decision has been made and you're no longer part of it. I thought about March, about how everyone had treated it like an idea rather than a point in time. I thought about how carefully the document had avoided saying what happened next. Because once you reach this part, the next stage doesn't need explaining. It just happens. The speaker crackled again. "Please remain seated." And for the first time since all of this began, I understood exactly what that meant. Not for now, not temporarily, but as a condition. The lights didn't go out, the doors didn't lock, nothing dramatic happened at all. Which was how I knew, with absolute certainty, that whatever came next would not be something you could opt out of. This was the point where before ended, and after didn't need a name yet. The moral of Book 1. The danger is not the system. The danger is how easily people adapt to it. More precisely, by the time something feels wrong enough to resist, most of the decisions that matter have already been made, calmly, politely, and voluntarily. Book 1 isn't about tyranny arriving, it's about normality absorbing change until resistance feels irrational. No villains, no evil masterminds, no dramatic moment where the reader can say, "This is where it went wrong." That's the point. What Book 1 is actually saying, control doesn't need fear, it needs administration. Compliance doesn't require belief, only habit. People don't need to agree, they just need to acknowledge. Removal doesn't look like arrest, it looks like absence. The scariest systems don't shout, they organize.